Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Welcome to the show. We're going to talk with Michael Shellenberger coming up in a little bit. He's the environmentalist who's now not apocalyptic about it all. He has a book called Apocalypse Never. Talk with him coming up. And then we have a Princeton professor who's against all this nonsense going on at Princeton right now. We'll talk with him in just a few minutes as well. But first, I want to talk about Chloe Valderay. I think she's really onto something here. We've been talking a lot on this show about the bad things, the bad forces, the bad philosophies going around and being injected into your kids' brains and heart. And we see these destructive influences everywhere in pop culture. We see the obvious ones, and there's much more insidious ones that we don't see. But we're going to start pivoting a little bit, or at least sprinkling in the alternatives and what is true. We did a little bit of that yesterday with the Hillsdale professor as well, and you're going to start seeing more of that just because I can't dive any more into the woke cult, quite frankly. So we need to start thinking about what should we be defending. Right? Now, I'm sure there's many ways to get to this truth, but I really like Chloe Valderay's. She has this thing called theory of enchantment, and it's about healing the connection and relationships between people. So where we have intersectionality, that's what's being preached today, that forces everyone to make assumptions about each other. Right? We are supposed, it's racism. We are to define each other by our skin color and financial status and all these other intersectional groups. Okay? That's not right. So what do we need to do instead? So she has 3 ways to bring together what she calls disconnected people. First, remember that we are human beings and not political extractions. We think, because we've been trained to believe this, that we're talking to political objects and not to people. And social media has made this really difficult for everyone. We've had a lot of practice, everyone has, over the last decade, of yelling at the computer at abstractions, at avatars, at fake people. And we forget that in real life, these are actual real people with actual motivations and traumas and difficulties in their life and reasons for thinking like they do. This is why we spent so much time talking about Marx and Rousseau the other day, because they're not just their ideas, they're not just their philosophies, they're real people too. So what drove them to come up with their toxic philosophies? And it all makes sense once you know their background. So that's the first thing. We are human beings, we're not political abstractions. Don't fall for the intersectionality trap. Second, if you're going to criticize in order to uplift and empower. That's 1 Thessalonians 5:11. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up. These are all biblical truths that Chloe's touching on. I don't know if she's doing that on purpose or not, but this is how I know that this will work and that these are the answers, because these are all based on scripture. So if the point here is if someone's being aggressive to you, you can curse them out, and that won't lead to anything good, right? For you, them, no one. Or you can say to them that you believe in their potential and that they are better than this empty rhetoric that they are spewing out mindlessly. So here's an example of this at work. This is the great Maya Angelou talking about an interaction she had with Tupac. Here it is.
I didn't know who he was, you know. I knew, I'd heard, he was into a big row with another young man. And so I said to him, may I speak to you? And he was cursing. Whew, I wouldn't give a... I said, I understand that, but let me speak to you. If these mother... I said, I got you. However, let me speak to you. And finally, I said, when was the last time anyone told you how important you are? Did you know our people stood on auction blocks, were sold, bought and sold? Did you know, so that you could stay alive today? And finally, he heard me and stopped talking and started to weep. And I put my arms around him and I walked him back into the arena, and he quieted. And I went back to my trailer, and Janet Jackson came running in. She said, Dr. Angelo, I don't believe you actually spoke to Tupac Shakur. So I said, darling, I don't know 6-pack, 4-pack. I never heard of him. But I mean,
I'd never heard of him.
That wasn't in my world.
How good is that? First, I love just her posture of wisdom. It's amazing. But how about that line? When was the last time anyone told you how important you are? Did you know that people stood on auction blocks, were bought and sold so that you could stay alive today? When is that message given to kids today, right? To young, poor kids, that you are important, you matter. That is a truly empowering message of you're better than this. Compare that to the woke cult today, which says you don't have to show up on time if you're black because that's a white value. You don't have to think objectively or rationally. You don't have to use white grammar or proper grammar because that's a white thing, right? That is a crippling message versus an empowering message. I despise the woke cult because the root of it for kids in particular is that you can't do it. You can't do it. The system's against you. I don't believe in you. You can't overcome. Your life is hopeless. The entire game, the entire deck is stacked against you no matter what you do. That is a story of destruction in our kids' souls versus what Maya just did there, which is a story of empowerment. Which leads to number 3. Everything that we have to do must be rooted in love and compassion. I want to play a clip of Chloe here speaking to this.
Which sounds very fake. But what it means is if someone is being aggressive towards you or mean towards you or whatever, you call that out as inappropriate. You say, I don't know you from Adam. I don't know why you're prejudging me, which is the definition of prejudice, right? But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to prejudge you, even though you have prejudged me. Instead, if you want, let's go to this coffee shop and let's actually talk about this topic X, topic Y, whatever we're having a disagreement over. Because what's happening in that moment is they're probably seeing you as a political abstraction, not as a full human being. And you have to rehumanize that space. And the purpose, by the way, is not to get that person to agree with every single viewpoint you have. The purpose of that is to bring back compassion and empathy, even in the midst of profound disagreement, which is something we are not doing so well here in America. So that's the theory of enchantment.
Love yourself, love others. If you don't, you'll be more likely to fall prey to the bad actors filled with rage, et cetera, like Tupac was. Example of that would be Daryl Scott. I talk about Daryl Scott in my book, How to Change Someone's Mind. It's like a short pamphlet. It's on Amazon now. You can get it if you want. Daryl Scott was a black man who deprogrammed hundreds of people from the Klan by forming relationships with them. Right? This guy is the archetype of how to have conversations with people. And when he would go to Klan rallies or meet with people, he would convert the Grand Dragons or whatever of the Klan. People would just hurl the worst things at him possible. And his reaction was, what does it have to do with me? Why did these things not bother him? Because he knew who he was. He was rooted and grounded and built his home on a rock so that he could depersonalize the attacks against them and just brush them aside. That is a strong person. That is a man with character. And that's what we all need more of. We need to develop more of that in our kids as well. We need to be people of character so that these tricks from the woke cult just brush right off. They don't even work. And the only reason they're able to take root like they do is because we've been told for so long life is hopeless and meaningless, to hate ourselves and to hate others. Start doing the opposite. Theoryofenchantment.com is Chloe's group. Coming up next, I want to talk with this Princeton professor who is speaking out against the insanity that's going on that campus. We'll do that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. We spent some time last week talking about this Princeton letter with 48 demands for the Princeton faculty, or for the administration. And it's totally out of control, but not unlike a lot of things that are going on college campuses. So the other day I read an article by 2 Princeton professors, and I just want to encourage the courage that it takes to speak out on our campuses. One of those professors is John Londrigan. He's a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton. Go Tigers. Professor, how are you, sir?
Very well. How are you today?
I'm really glad you're here. You wrote this open letter saying that, tongue-in-cheek, that we should cancel Democrats, and you went through all the things, the racist things that Democrats have done in history. A couple years ago, you signed a letter defending freedom of speech and the importance of it. How do you still have a job, sir?
Well, there is the tenure system.
You're protected. Even then, are you worried? In all seriousness, are you worried about being fired or any other professional ramifications for speaking out?
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of faculty who are concerned about fitting in and going with the herd. That's a problem. My view of the matter is that tenure allows somebody with average morals to do the right thing.
And in your case, I like that line.
There's always the concern that, gee, there should be more people doing the right thing.
Yeah. Why aren't there?
I think there's probably some pressure to conform. To be fair to my colleagues, we're all very busy. We have a lot of things to do. And so it's quite easy, if everyone around you agrees about something, to just sign on. If a petition came around your neighborhood about doing something with a local park, and all your neighbors were for it, you probably wouldn't look deeply into it. You might just sign. And so there's an element to just go along. And then there's another element to just strongly believe that if you know the right thing to do, you should just make everybody get in lockstep behind you, which is very unfortunate.
Maybe we'll start with the letter. We'll start specific, and then we'll get more bigger picture here. What of those 48 demands is most concerning to you?
The one of the demands called for the constitution of a faculty committee that would review research and writing to make sure that it wasn't racist. Now, let's be clear. When people start impinging on other people's rights, they always do it for a good cause. It's never for a bad cause. And so the cause is wonderful. We don't want people to be racist. But having a faculty committee that reviews your research before it goes out, A, will probably turn into some kind of court of Star Chamber, and B, you shouldn't have prior restraint on what people say. That's counter to not just to the spirit of the First Amendment, but to its letter. And it's counter to the Chicago principles that my colleagues adopted recently. I think it was end of 2015. Recognizing that free speech is at the heart of the university's mission of inquiry.
I have it right here. This faculty committee would oversee the investigation and discipline of racist behaviors, incidents, research, and publications on part of the faculty. That's you. And I think my problem is the definition of the word racist. Surely, Professor, someone could find, the letter you wrote, the essay you wrote in the National Review. That's racist by their standard.
Sure. If you allow the term to be sufficiently flexible, anything is.
What's a big picture now, just campus-wise or Princeton specifically? What's just the vibe on campus? What's a concern that you have about just the change of higher education over time?
Well, I think higher education is always sort of one step. What's the old saying? We're always one generation away from barbarism. And higher education is dealing with young people who are finding their way in the world, and young people can be very energetic. And if that goes amiss, it can go amiss very badly. Most of the time it doesn't, but I think there's always been a possibility of people erupting into intolerance and violence. And that possibility is there today. Maybe the lava is a little closer to the surface recently in this sort of perpetual volcano.
Yeah, I just find it so interesting that in America, I don't know, at least I feel like incorrectly, we'll never be like, Stalin, like a Stalinist state, or we'll never erupt into violence like you speak of. We're better than that, or we're different than that, or whatever. And it's like, no,
Never say
we're
never.
yeah, like we're just as bad as anyone else ever. So A, why do I think that we'll never like have a civil war again, which was only 155 years ago, not that long ago? And what makes us no different than anyone else? I know you study a lot in South America. We're no better than people in South America, right?
I think I'm married to someone from South America, so I need to try to especially carefully. I would say that American exceptionalism is something that we have to achieve every day. It's not something that's given to us.
Great. Love that. Freedom of speech, why is that no longer obvious to many young people in particular, the importance of that?
That is a fascinating question, and I wish I knew the answer. The freedom of speech petitions I've signed struck me as a bit platitudinous. I didn't think any of it needed to be said because precisely it was so obvious, and yet it's no longer obvious to others. It is reminiscent of the discussions in the Cold War. You look too young to remember some of this, but back in the Cold War, people would talk about the denial of human rights in communist countries, and the communists would come back, well, your list of human rights is too short. It also includes the right to a free education, the right to free medicine, the right to free indoctrination. So we'll tell you exactly what to think. And they didn't deliver on any of it, but then they would say, well, if there are hungry people in America, then America is violating their rights. And so it's okay for us to lock people up who speak against us. And somehow that confusion about rights got transmitted to us, and I'm not sure how.
Wow. So how would they have? That was beautiful, and I want to sit more on that. How would they, the Soviets or whoever, how would they have defined rights versus how should we be defining rights in America?
Well, de facto, the definition of rights was everyone is equally without them. But de jure, their rights included rights to outcomes as well as rights to opportunities. I think that's, if you wanted to boil it down, that's what it seems to come to. Our notion of rights fundamentally have to do with rights to opportunities, to opportunity and rights to not be transgressed. And if you go through the Bill of Rights, pretty much everything falls into one of those categories. And
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you, sir, please.
Well, but they simply appended to that set of concerns that they were perfectly happy to violate, by the way, but they appended to that rights to outcomes.
Yeah, that's right. Now, the argument would be...
Well,
the argument would be from... Go ahead.
Well, in the Declaration of Independence, there's the notion of the right to the pursuit of happiness. And I think the communist view was, well, what's this business about pursuit? Just the right to happiness. And we'll tell you what it is, of course, but why limit it to pursuit?
Yes. So why should we keep pursuit then?
Because my definition of your happiness might be different than your definition of your happiness.
Yes.
There was an old Twilight Zone episode about
love stories that start with this.
Yes, and maybe I've just violated some kind of copyright, but there was an old television episode once upon a time about a motorcyclist who's killed in an accident, and he winds up in a hotel room in San Diego with an elderly couple. No, I'm sorry. He winds up in a room with an elderly couple who are watching their slides from their trip to San Diego. It's a hotel room, but they're watching the elderly couple's slides from a trip to San Diego, and it goes on. And there's a kind of master of ceremonies who's in charge of all of this. And he goes to the master of ceremonies and says, "No, this is horrible. This is hell." And the master of ceremonies sort of smirks and says, "Well, yes, you figured it out. Your life wasn't exemplary." And the guy is sort of collapsing into depression. And then the MC says, "Well, for some people, this is heaven."
Yes. but in the Soviet Union, you'd think in the end it was hell for everyone. No,
they picked what was right for you. They knew better.
Now they would argue. I think many students on your campus would argue that you can't pursue happiness in America because of systemic racism. There is no even opportunity to do so. What's your argument there?
Well, if they're on our campus, they've got some opportunities. Is the short but somewhat smug answer. The longer answer is yes, there are variations in opportunity. Yes, we have an imperfect system. People get killed in drive-by shootings. People get killed in traffic accidents, and that's a deplorable outcome, and we should do what we can to stop it. That said, I would rather be poor in America than King of England 500 years ago.
Love that. I thought you were going to say rather than poor anywhere else.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, but I think it's probably it's probably true also.
Yeah. Professor Kurtz had a line the other day, somewhat smug as well, but true, that there's some faculty or talking about invisible work done by faculty or whatever, and there are no more privileged people in the planet in history than a faculty member at Princeton, right?
So I'm told.
You're one of them.
This is sort of my chairman's lead into, by the way, you're teaching this course, John.
Yeah. Professor John Londrigan, sir, thanks for speaking out. Thanks for writing that piece in National Review. Thanks for letting us know there's still sanity in some of our universities. Real quick, would you send your kids or grandkids to Princeton?
Absolutely. My kids, none of them wanted to apply, so I couldn't convince them to do that. But yes, I think they'd be fine here. As fine as they would be anywhere.
Fair. John Londrigan. Professor, good to talk to you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for an interesting conversation.
Thank you so much. Coming up next, Michael Shellenberger, author of Apocalypse Never. Do that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. I first heard about this book from the great Scott Adams. He sent out a tweet a couple weeks ago, and he said, I don't say this lightly, but I'm reading this book now, advanced copy, and it might be one of the most important books in the world. More about this later. That indeed sparked some interest. The book is called Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All, and it's by Michael Shellenberger. Mr. Shellenberger, how are you, sir?
Good, thanks for having me.
You've had many ringing endorsements and now a bestseller as well. Congratulations. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but could you take a minute to explain your environmentalist bona fides, right? You're not some right-wing hack coming in debunking the climate change movement here. So what have you done in the past?
Well, I've been an environmental activist for 33 years. I was invited by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to be an expert reviewer of their next assessment report. I have been an advocate for both renewables and nuclear energy. Been a left-wing activist for a long time as well, so it's really just been my whole life's work.
Why did you get involved in environmentalism in the first place 33 years ago?
I mean, mostly my parents took me camping as a boy, and I just fell in love with the natural world. There's a lot of human beings on Earth, and it's obvious that we're having a large impact on natural landscapes. And so it was always something I cared about. But I also cared about people. I was never an anti-human environmentalist. I always thought that we should have the goal of lifting everybody out of poverty. I spent time in Latin America in my when I was 17, I first went, but I also spent a bunch of my early 20s in the Brazilian Amazon, and I saw that environmental destruction wasn't something that people wanted to do. It was something that people had to do to survive, and that there were trade-offs, and that we had to figure out a way to balance those. And so that's always been my life's commitment, has been how do you achieve these two goals of universal prosperity and environmental protection.
That's super important. I want to get back to that. Let's make note of that. Let's fast forward. Where was there a turning point in your thinking that ultimately led you to write this book?
There was probably three turning points. I mean, there was a point in the early 2000s where it became obvious that dealing with problems like climate change would have to be technological, and because people wouldn't voluntarily become poor, that nobody wants to be poor, everybody wants to become wealthier, and that there's still billions of people in the world that don't have their basic necessities met. And then the second shift, I think, was probably 10 years ago when I felt that we needed nuclear power in addition to renewables in order to solve climate change. And then more recently, I came to question whether we needed renewables at all, and in fact realized that renewables have a really negative environmental consequence and that we would be better off just transitioning to nuclear. And that's when I developed my view that really there's a hierarchy of energy, and that any step up the energy ladder from wood and dung to coal to oil and natural gas to uranium was beneficial. That it wasn't just one technology, but it was really, what was really important was that process.
I love how you mentioned wood and particularly dung. I remember I read a while back that still one of, if not the leading cause of death in the world, are respiratory illnesses that come from people burning animal dung inside of their homes, which is wild. And I feel like a lot of environmentalists would want to deny that part of the world this hierarchy of energy use. Is that right? And where would you like us to go on that hierarchy? Where should we be moving?
Yeah, I mean, there's the physical hierarchy and the moral and environmental hierarchy are the same thing. You want to go towards energy dense fuels that produce more energy with less natural resource. And so if you hold a lump of wood in your hand, it can cook a pot of beans. That's it. But if you have a lump of uranium, can provide me with all the energy I need in my entire high energy life. And so that's called energy density. And then that's reflective in the world. So what's called the power densities, the energy that comes from converting natural resources into electricity or some other usable energy, are very low in forests. They're much higher in coal mines. They're higher in oil and gas wells, and then they're very high with uranium for nuclear power plants. Environmentalists have viewed economic growth, prosperity, and technology as harmful to the natural environment in a really kind of blunt and maybe stupid way. There's not a lot of subtlety there. There's just this idea that wealth itself is bad. And so in Apocalypse Never, what I show is all this research showing that as we get wealthier, there's all these ways in which we use less natural environment. So we use less natural environment to produce energy, but also we use less natural environment to produce food, which is far and away humankind's largest environmental impact.
I'm sorry, we got to address this before we even get more details. I love I don't want to say if it's a nuance of thinking, but you mentioned the balance before as well. We got to speak more to that, because I'm just hearing it in everything you're talking about. What do many environmentalists, why do they not have that? Or what are they lacking, you think, that you have when it comes to making this proper balance?
I mean, obviously, there's just a big part of it that's just ignorance of some basic facts and some basic processes of how humans save nature. So the first third of Apocalypse Never is a debunking of popular environmental myths on climate change, species extinction, plastic waste, rainforest destruction. The second third is how humans save nature. So we save nature by not using it, and we can avoid using it by creating substitutes or by using it more efficiently. So I give the example of that we save the whales by creating alternatives to whale oil, first in the form of petroleum as a substitute for whale oil used in lamps, and then second as vegetable oil, which was a substitute used for whale oil and margarine and soap. And then the third part of the book looks at why if environmental problems are real but manageable and not the end of the world, and the solutions tend to be more progress, more prosperity, more technological innovation, why do environmentalists oppose those things? And I look at three factors: money, power, and religion, and basically conclude that environmentalism is the dominant religion of secular elites in Western and non-Western societies, and that that apocalyptic environmentalism is playing the same role that Christianity played for people, often with very similar archetypal structures or symbolic structures that the people who are true believers are basically unaware of.
Wow, this is so important. All right, so let's do that. Do you mind if we go a little deeper there? Because I've heard similar analogies made for the woke cult that we have today as well. That it's kind of a religion too. James Lindsay makes that point a lot. So let's do that with environmentalism. Break it down. What are some key parallels?
Right. So what religion provides? Traditionally, religion provides a way to deal with the fear of death, and so humans are unique among animals in that we become aware that we're going to die at a young age, around 4 or 5. And so what we now think occurs, and this is all based on, everything in my book is based on the best available science and scholarship, and that goes for psychology and anthropology as well. So it appears that what happens is that because it's hard to get up in the morning and function if you're afraid of dying every minute, so we repress those fears, and then religion has traditionally provided a way to deal with those fears. So there's usually a story of how we live on after we die, whether that's in Christianity or in Hinduism in terms of reincarnation. So if people stop believing that, then they're left with their fear. And what we find is that most people want to construct some story about how they will live on. And so what happens is that we start to want to live on basically by being heroic, by telling a story about ourselves where we save the world, and that will be our legacy on earth. And so, and then the other thing that happens is that religion traditionally provided morality, so think of the 10 Commandments, that was your basic morality. Well, if you don't think that that there's going to be some decision by God at the end of your life, whether you go to heaven or hell, based on how you acted according to that morality, then you start to see these alternative moralities emerge. And so that's what's happening right now, is that basically what you see is the people that are on the street for Black Lives Matter are basically the same people that were in the street for climate change. They're people who are feeling insecure about their own status in life, they're feeling insecure about the global system. We had a global order, and now there's a reversion towards nationalism in the form of Brexit and Trump. And that's created a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. And so I think that what people are doing is they're wanting to, the people in the streets, they want to show that they are moral. Usually, it's like here in Berkeley, in my very white upper middle class neighborhood, it's white people want to show other white people that they are more moral. And so they put up signs about Black Lives Matter or about climate change. And the idea is to sort of gain some status and some feeling of superiority in this midst of feeling very anxious. And so there's a kind of underlying, and you see it with Greta Thunberg, you see it with other environmental activists. I certainly felt it with myself, which is that when you feel uncertain or insecure about your own life, what you're doing with this moralizing against eating meat, flying on airplanes, driving in cars, is you're trying to sort of say, I'm more moral than you, I'm better than you, but in a way that is socially acceptable, because so much of the society, has come to believe that climate change is this, world-threatening, phenomenon, or similarly that racism is increasing. And so the idea is that actually we're constructing that the apocalyptic nature of this is something that people are promoting in order to make themselves feel heroic and better about their own lives.
That's so spot on, Michael. It's beautiful. Can you give an example of how you did that and how you felt when you did some of this moralizing?
Yeah, I point out at the end of the book, because it's obviously a very sensitive issue, because we can't ever see into somebody else's motivations. And so I'm very careful in the book not to say that I know why Greta Thunberg is an activist, or I know why climate activists do what they do. So I talk about how when I was most apocalyptic myself, which was about 20 years ago, it was because I was unhappy in my own life about certain things that didn't really have much to do with the environment. And so I think that what I was doing was trying to gain some sense of control and some sense of social standing and status by basically talking about the end of the world and how we could be heroic in saving it. it doesn't ever totally go away. I mean, obviously, like I wrote this book because I want to make the world a better place. I would like for this book to be my legacy to some extent. I have this idea that it'll live on. So it's not like there's something necessarily wrong with being heroic. You have a radio show, you want it to have an impact on the world. There's nothing wrong with wanting to make the world a better place. I think that you start to get into problems and really bad behavior, particularly the scapegoating and demonization of people. I think that starts to happen when we become unaware that we ourselves have these basic psychological or what you might call existential needs. And so when I wrote Apocalypse Never, I was just hopeful that people might get some distance from their own needs and behaviors, and we might start to look at them and get a little bit more control over them. Because on the one hand, it's a beautiful thing to go and create things in the world and do things in the world. But when you lose sight of the fact that you're doing it for sort of personal reasons, it leads people to treat other people very badly. And I think we're starting to see that, where there's sort of this idea that there's just a lot of very racist people in the United States that are secret about it, and we have to expose them as racists, or this idea that it's a bunch of people that really hate nature. You know, there's all these people that want to do bad things to nature in the short term because they're greedy. That's just not what climate change is. It's not really what any environmental problem is. These are problems that are a consequence of people trying to help each other and trying to make their families have better lives. These are side effects of altruistic behaviors. And so the idea that there's this idea right now, I think it's very toxic and terrible, which is that bad things in the world are because of bad intentions. And similarly, this idea that good things only result from good things. You know, we know that sometimes good things result from bad things. So I think we need to have a more grown-up view of the world, including a more grown-up morality.
Mike, can I cut you off here real quick? Do you have 5 more minutes for us? Can we take a quick break and we got 5 more minutes? Because I want to talk about the money and the power part real quick.
That's fine, sure. I'll stick around.
The book is Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Again, Scott Adams says it may be one of the most important books in the world. And I think you can see why. Apocalypse Never by Michael Shellenberger. More with Michael next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to talk more with Michael Shellenberger, his book, Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Michael, I'm just so fascinated again by the psychology, if you will, the motivation behind people who are doing this. Because I've always said there's environmental leaders and there's environmental followers. So my mom is like an environmental follower. She wants a clean planet and clean air and all these other like noble, good, obvious things that we all like. But then there's leaders. And I think maybe there's different things going on there. And you talked about money, power, and religion. We just talked about religion. Can we spend some time on the money and the power? Let's just do money. Well, what are the monetary motivations for the leaders?
Sure. Yeah, one thing I'll say too about the difference between followers and leaders is that, there's people that they go to the grocery store and a product is marked as natural. And so they go, well, that's a better product. It's marked as natural. That's most people in their relationship to things like renewable energy, solar and wind. They kind of go, that sounds natural. It sounds good. There's an interesting question about how did we come to see things that were natural as good, because it wasn't always that way. It's only in the last few hundred years actually that we thought things that were natural were good. But that's that. But then there's the leaders and the advocates of renewables, and I document in Apocalypse Never how over the last 50 years their reasons for wanting renewables were different than just saying that it was natural. There was some of that, but it was also this idea that renewables can't power an industrial civilization, and that they would be the way that we would go back to a low energy agricultural civilization. Most people don't know this. Most people who lobby for renewables don't know this. But historians, for example, we now know that there could not have been an industrial revolution with wood, that they needed coal in order to have the higher energy and power densities that are required to run these powerful machines and factories and trains. And so we've known that renewables can't power a high energy civilization for a really long time. And so there's obviously money interests now that are just, it's really, I would say the biggest ones are renewables. And then also there's this alliance actually between some natural gas interests and solar and industrial solar and wind farms to replace nuclear plants, which are about 20% of our electricity. Nuclear is the largest source of electricity from low carbon sources in the wealthy developed world. So there's definitely been an alliance by fossil fuel and renewable energy companies to attack nuclear. And so I document those ties in the money chapter. And then sorry, go ahead.
No, please, you.
And then in terms of power, I mean, the power chapter is referring to a bunch of different forms of power. The big argument in the power chapter is that most apocalyptic environmentalists are followers of an 18th century British economist named Thomas Malthus, who said there will always be we're going to always produce too many humans and not enough food. It sounds weird because it never happened. In fact, it's never happened. We always make more food, and so we have the biggest food surpluses in human history right now. We produce about 25% more food than we need globally. And in fact, when you look at famines in the past, the famines are a consequence of war and politics. It's not because suddenly people didn't know how to grow enough food. Like, humans are really good at growing food and producing food. That's just something that we've always been good at. If we weren't, then there wouldn't be 7.5 billion people on Earth, up from zero, or up from, it's only 2 billion a century ago. So the idea was always wrong. But more than that, the Malthusian idea was used, especially starting in the 60s, to make the case for depriving poor countries cheap and abundant energy for industrialization, for agriculture. And in fact, it's notable that some of the critics of Apocalypse Never are defenders of this tradition, which I consider an unethical tradition. It's a tradition that has always argued for letting people starve, under the idea that there would be less suffering in the future if there's more starvation now. And so I show how basically after it became clear that that human birth rate had peaked and declined, and that eventually the total human population would peak and decline, it was then that Malthusians emphasized climate change, and that climate change became the alternative environmental issue for Malthusian scientists and activists and others. And it was a power move against poor countries.
Why would one back in the 1800s or today want lower income people and countries to not have either electricity or food? What's the root of that?
Well, I think the sad part of that is that I just think there's some people that feel better about themselves by keeping other people down. Wow. For me personally, I feel better about myself when I think about being part of trying to lift everybody out of poverty. But I think there's some people that I think we all know these people where they feel better about themselves by putting other people down. Yeah. I think to some extent we all feel some instinct to feel better than other people. We're just selfish animals in that way. But I think with Malthusianism, it takes it to another level. Malthus himself, he wrote his book because he got so tired of hearing people talk about how everybody could have a prosperous life and how humans could, that we could have all this progress. Something about it he just hated. And he was kind of a small person. He was, and that's, I think, what I find when I read other Malthusians is that these are people that they just really don't like the idea of everybody living like them. And so they say things like that. Not everybody can live like we live. And when they get accused of hypocrisy, then they kind of, they say, no, I'm going to, have a more efficient car or something, usually some symbolic act. And so,
Sorry, Mike, I hate to cut you. I love how you get to the root and the psychology of all this. We've been doing that with Karl Marx and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Like, once you get to know these people, then the philosophies that they've created make a lot of sense, unfortunately. And the followers of them make a lot of sense as well. And that's interesting to do that with Malthus, too. I got 30 seconds here, Michael, and I hope this has encouraged everyone to read the book Apocalypse Never. Do you think it's possible with technological improvement to have to only have cities run on renewable energies, or is that just not even an objective we should even be striving for? We should be moving more towards nuclear and whatever the next level is after that.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with renewables is the same problem we've always had, which is that the power densities are too low. So I cite the best available science, which shows that right now we use about 0.5% of land for energy production. If you were to go towards 100% renewables, you would need to use somewhere between 25 and 50% of all the land for energy production. Well, that would be an ecological disaster. And so renewables, I mean, this is the craziest part of it all, is that renewables are just the worst kind of energy for the natural environment for inherently physical reasons. And so it's maybe one of the biggest episodes of mass brainwashing in history, that people came to see renewables as good for the environment when they're so terrible.
Michael Shellenberger, Apocalypse Never. I'm sure you've had many consequences to kind of your change of thinking and the new arguments that you've been making professionally. But I hope you in the future have many more because of this new message. Because I know it's hard to leave a tribe, if you will. It's an unsafe thing to do, to be rejected by all the people who used to invite you to speak and used to call you a friend. But I hope you find a new tribe, as much as I hate that. I hope you find the tribe of truth and people embrace you for being in that tribe. How about that? Is that a fair? Is that the proper way to put that? Apocalypse Never, Michael Shellenberger. Thanks, Michael. Let's do it again, brother.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
True story, Mike Slater. See you tomorrow. Spread the word.